Well, this is lecture 15 in social neuroscience, and we're going to be looking at attraction today. And what I mean by attraction is really sexual attraction. And so we're going to be talking about some evolutionary theories that are relevant to human sexual attraction. Then, kind of following up on the last two lectures, we're going to look at how evolution and culture maybe provide different explanations about attraction. And we'll look at sort of a debate between two leaders in this field, David Buss and Alice Eagly. Then we're going to look at sexual strategies theory in more detail. We'll talk more about facial attractiveness, and then we'll answer the question, is attraction or beauty rewarding? All right, so let's talk about some theories relevant to the evolution of human sexual behavior. So these all come from evolutionary biology. One of these would be the theory of inclusive fitness. This is talked about a bit in Sapolsky's book in the evolution chapter. It was proposed by Hamilton in 1964. It's also known as kin selection. The idea behind the theory of inclusive fitness is that natural selection will favor phenotypes that increase the chances of genes being passed on, whether or not the individual is the ancestor. So the idea here is that natural selection is going to favor any kind of phenotypes, any sort of particular traits that would mean that most of the genes can get passed on to the next generation, regardless of whether or not that person is directly the parent of the succeeding generation. Okay, so the idea should be that we're going to want to maybe find traits in humans that will basically favor them wanting to be and helping people who are more related to them, who have more of their genetics, than in people, for instance, who do not share their genetics. One example of this comes from something called the Cinderella effect, which is this hypothesis that men should want to give more resources to their genetic children than they would, for instance, to their stepchildren. And so this is a fairly straightforward study. What you can see is that Anderson et al. Looked at the odds that a man would give financial support to children who were attending university. And the children were classified into one of four types. So the first way you could think of this is whether or not the man is the child's genetic father or the man is the child's stepfather. And then the other, what we see up there at the top, is that if the child's mother is the man's current partner, or that this child their mother is the man's previous partner. And so we have these four classes: class 1, class 2, class 3, class 4. And you might suspect then that with class 1, where the child is their genetic offspring, that the man's can be more likely to want to go ahead and give financial support to them, particularly maybe when the man is the current partner with the mother. Even if they're not if they're not currently with each other, still the man who's the child's genetic father in class 2 would probably support their offspring more than the cases that you see there for 3 and 4. At least that's what was hypothesized. So here were the data from that particular article, and you can see that class 2 is considered the baseline. So that's where you have a genetic child and the partners are not together anymore. But you can see compared to that condition of class 2, where was class 1, class 3, and class 4? Well, class 1, there was much more likelihood that the father was going to give resources to a genetic child of somebody who was their current mate. But you can see that in class 3 and class 4, that only was class 4 when they had a stepchild from a previous mate, that you can really see a substantially less money being given to that child during university. The first one, by the way, is sort of interesting even in the sense that class 1, having a genetic child with your current partner versus a genetic child with a previous partner, is having a huge impact, right? So it looks like between class 1 and class 2, there's a big difference in the resources, even though they're genetically related to them. So that status of the relationship does matter here, but you can see that those stepchildren are just not going to benefit the same amount as somebody who's genetically related to the father. All right, so that's the Cinderella effect, just sort of evidence of kin selection on a human level. We can also look at another important theory that'd be relevant here to understanding sexual attraction in humans, and that would be sexual selection theory that Darwin talked about. And Darwin did talk about this with other animals as well as humans, that there should be intra-sexual competition, so things that are going to cause features or phenotypes that would allow one member of that sex to have more access or more likely to have offspring than other members of that sex. And then intersexual selection is more about how you attract the opposite sex to want to mate with you. And so Darwin had a lot to say about those. And so that gets incorporated in these explanations of the evolution of sexual behavior. Then we have parental investment theory that was proposed by Trivers in 1972. And the idea behind this theory is that the sex that invests more in the offspring should be choosier about potential mates. So the idea here is that if you don't really have much that you have to invest in here in terms of once the child is born, or even when the child is being conceived, then you should be less choosy then about who you mate with because you don't really have a big investment in the whole thing. Whereas if you're, for instance, a human female who's going to have to carry a child for 9 months and then have this dependent child for even more years after that, you might think from Trivers' theory that a human female would be choosier about who their potential mate is than a human male who can basically get the woman pregnant and is done. He doesn't really have to physically be around to have his offspring be produced the way that the mother is really quite obligated, biologically speaking, to their offspring. So Trivers has made this sort of prediction to not only apply to humans, but to other animals out there. And there are a lot of variations in how much different members of a sex of a species have to put into their offspring. And so this parental investment theory is supposed to apply across the animal kingdom. This would even then apply to what's called the Coolidge effect. And so I'm going to go ahead and tell you about the Coolidge effect. It comes from a joke, and you can actually look this up on Wikipedia, having to do with this president, Calvin Coolidge, who was the U.S. president from 1923 to 1929. And the way the story goes is that this American president, Calvin Coolidge, and his wife visited a poultry farm. And they were being shown separately around that farm when Mrs. Coolidge came to a chicken yard and noticed that a rooster there was mating very frequently. She asked the attendant how often that happened and was told, dozens of times each day. Mrs. Coolidge said, well, tell that to the president when he comes by. Well, that's not all the joke is. So a little bit later, the president, when he heard this information, asked the farmer, does each rooster service the same hen each time? Do they only have the one partner? No, replied the farmer. There are many hens for each rooster. Perhaps you could point that out to Mrs. Coolidge, replied the president. So that's the joke, right? So you can understand the little humor behind this. This leads us, though, to what's known now as the Coolidge effect. And the idea is that the frequency of sex for males is positively correlated with the number of available partners. Okay? So it's going to say that if there are more partners around for a male to mate with, they're just going to have more partners because of that. So this one rooster has a whole lot of hens around him, he's going to have more chances for having sex, and because he's got more partners. That's the Coolidge effect. And here's a study that kind of supports this in humans. You can see what they're looking at here is in the first question, they said, they asked people, males and females, you can see they had 1,862 and 2,905 females, and they were either under 30 or over the age of 30. And the first item was, if you're not, indicate whether or not you're not getting enough sex at the moment. And you can see that 55 to 56% of the males and about 41% of the females agreed with this statement. So of those people who said that they're not getting enough sex at the moment, and there's, like I said, more males saying this than females, then the question was, well, what would your ideal be? And A says, having more sex with my spouse or my steady partner. And you can see that around 62 to 63% of the females said that they would like to have more sex with their spouse or steady partner, whereas only 37 to 38% of the males said they would. Now, next item was, well, if you're not having enough sex, the ideal might be to have more exciting variations with your partner. And you can see the males are a little bit higher on this. The females are less. This is less of a ideal for them. But finally, if your ideal is that you're not getting enough sex, how about just having more partners? And you can see that males endorse this more highly than females do. So 38 to 37% of the men, whether they were under 30 or over 30, said they would love to have more partners. Females, this wasn't so. They would be happy enough just to be with their partner. So they have a lower indication of this. So again, it says that perhaps this gender difference in males and females in terms of how many partners they want to have could go back to the Coolidge effect, to this parental investment theory, to the whole idea here that because there's more partners available for those men and they don't really have to put much effort into it, they're more likely to have sex than the female would. Okay, so those are the three main things to pay attention to about that particular study. Now that I've given you these sort of basic evolutionary biology explanations about sexual attraction, I I want to now put this all together and show you a short video in which you're going to see David Buss, who's an evolutionary psychologist in social psychology, kind of use all of those theories to make important predictions about human sexual behavior. And then you're going to see Alice Eagly, who is more of a cultural psychologist, or at least a psychologist who pays more attention to the environment or the situation, come up with an alternative explanation for that. So I'll go ahead and show you that video now.
Sexual motivation enables species survival. Attraction is the first step. In non-human species, hormones activate the mating process. Mating strategies are not particularly variable. Males often compete aggressively for dominance over more than one female. We humans each owe our existence to the attraction between a particular man and a particular woman. Everywhere, people show preferences for certain romantic partners. But what shapes those preferences? Are they universal? Do all people look for the same qualities in a potential mate? Theorists disagree on the role that evolution and culture play in social attraction. Dr. David Buss is a proponent of an evolutionary explanation.
Evolutionary psychology makes a very powerful set of predictions about sex differences in mating strategies, and these stem from fundamental sex differences in human reproductive biology. I'll mention just two. One is the fact that fertilization occurs internally within women and not within men, and this has posed a very important adaptive problem for men, namely the problem of paternity uncertainty. Some cultures use the phrase mama's baby, papa's maybe to describe this asymmetry there. Men are never sure whether they're the fathers. Women are always 100% sure. A second major difference in reproductive biology is what is called the minimum obligatory parental investment. If we ask the question, how much investment does a man or a woman need to put in to produce a single child? In the woman's case, it's tremendous. That 9-month period of pregnancy, it's metabolically costly, and this is a tremendous cost that is not borne by men. And so these sex differences in fundamental aspects of human reproductive biology have given rise to psychological sex differences.
Dr. Alice Eagly is a proponent of the social structural theory. She looks at mate selection from a different perspective.
We choose partners, our long-term partners, in the constraints of the role system that we have, particularly the marital role system. So one would, as a woman, want a man who would do a good job of however the male, the father, husband role is defined in the society, and a man similarly would want a woman to do a good job of however it's defined in society. So we're looking for good exemplars in terms of the marital role system and the broader gender role system that's apparent in our society.
Buss believes his evolutionary theory finds support in a study of 37 different cultures around the world. He and his colleagues simply asked men and women what they preferred in a mate. They discovered remarkable similarities across these differing cultures.
What we found is there was one particular cluster in all 37 cultures that women valued more than men. It's what I call the resource cluster. Basically, women universally, more than men, valued partners who had good financial prospects, who were economically stable, and even more important, who had the personality characteristics that lead to resources and resource acquisition over time. These are things like a man's ambition, drive, industriousness, social status, and even older age, somewhat older age. Women typically want partners who are 3 to 4 years older than they are, and we know that statistically a somewhat older age is linked with greater resources and greater social status. We found one very powerful sex difference something that men wanted more than women. Basically boils down to two characteristics. One is things associated with youth, and the other is things associated with physical appearance or physical attractiveness. These are obviously related. Physical appearance provides a wealth of information about a woman's fertility or reproductive value, that is, her ability to have children in the future. And men who, in our evolutionary past, who selected fertile women, they out-reproduced men who tended to select infertile women. And so men's mate preferences focus heavily on physical appearance cues to fertility. So things like clear skin, youthful appearance, lustrous hair, full lips, symmetrical features, signs of good health, signs of youth. These are things that men value more than women.
If it's built into the species, you should see it pretty much every place. So my colleague Wendy Wood and I were interested in that, and we looked at the data from the 37 culture study. It appeared to us that there was a fair amount of variability across the 37 cultures in the extent to which you get sex-differentiated mate selection. And our thought was that, well, that should follow some rules, the rules of the social structural theory. That is, when men and women are very differently placed in social roles, they should choose rather differently. So if there's a strong division of labor between homemakers and providers, and the women are really confined to the home, then you should get big differences in mate selection. And in other kinds of societies, such as our own, where these differences have moderated to some extent, most women are employed, men and women aren't so differently placed, then the sex differences in mate selection should get smaller, because they're due to the placement of men and women in different roles in society.
Eagly obtained data from the United Nations on gender equality. These studies compared men and women in various societies according to the division of labor. She found enough variation in the results to suggest that sex differences in mate selection tend to erode in cultures in which there is greater gender equality. The more similar the roles of men and women, the more people tend to choose someone like themselves.
Good morning, Vanilla Industries.
The debate over gender differences in mate preferences raises the larger issue of the relative contributions of biology and culture to human social behavior. Such accounts need not be contradictory. Indeed, biology and culture interact. Biological factors operate within a cultural context, and culture builds on a biological foundation. Proponents of the various theories of attraction and mate selection continue their quest. Their work may ultimately lead to a theory that integrates biological, psychological, and social factors.
Right, that video is more than 20 years old, and of course there's been developments since then. And if I had more time in this course, I would gladly get into more of the details that have happened in the last 20 years. But I really wanted to use this lecture to kind of set the stage so you can kind of see the bigger sort of evolution versus cultural explanations of some of the data that we're going to be talking about here. Now, you saw that Buss talked a lot about what something he calls sexual strategies theory that he proposed all the way back in 1992. And this is a theory of human sexual attraction that's supposedly based on principles of evolutionary biology. So the theory predicts that there's going to be intrasexual and intersexual selection pressures, just like Darwin talked about. In terms of intersexual selection, he thought there would be specialized signals that are going to appeal to the opposite sex. That there are signals that are given off that indicate that the animal will be a good parent. Here, the animal could be a human, right? So the human could give off signals that they could be a good parent. And also, there are going to be signals that indicate that they have good genes. And the idea here is that when you're thinking about mating with somebody, you're going to be looking for somebody who has good genes so that your offspring have a better chance of survival and making it in the world. So, when you think about that in terms of human terms, and then we think about what men are doing and what women are doing, and remembering that in parental investment theory, men don't really have to put as much into having an offspring as women do, who are going to be carrying the baby for 9 months and then have a baby that they have to nurse and stuff before the baby can actually be independent. That means then that men are really constrained, though, in their reproduction by the number of women willing to mate with them. So even though we said in the Coolidge effect, they'll mate with as many available hens that are available there, the idea, though, is sexual strategy theory is saying, well, those choosy females, they're going to be really choosy. And so they're not going to just mate with anybody. And so there's this constraint then actually being put on men in their reproduction by the number of women willing to mate with them. And so therefore, according to sexual strategies theory, men face 4 problems. Trying to maximize the number of partners, because the more partners they can impregnate, they're more likely they're going to have offspring. Trying to identify which of them are accessible, so which one are actually available for mating. And so they're going to be looking for clues that a particular female is available for mating. Third, they're going to have to try to identify which of the females that are out there are fertile, because from an evolutionary point of view, from sexual strategy theory, there's not really much point in having sex with somebody who's not fertile, because you're not going to be able to have your offspring. And finally, you want to try to minimize your commitment and investment so that you can move on and find another partner that you could possibly have an offspring with. So that's what sexual strategies theory says. What about data? Do the data seem to support this kind of theoretical approach? And there are some data that sort of support this. For example, if you just look at undergraduate students, like these are people between 18 and 22 years old, and asking them, how many partners would you like to have over the next period of time? You could say over the next month, over the next 6 months, the next year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, all the way up across your entire life. And you can see that they have an indication there on the line of the bottom, that's dashed line. That's for female participants in terms of the number of partners they would like to have. And you can see that over the 1 month, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years from now, they only want a couple partners, right? So they have a fairly low number of partners. They never even really get above 5 overall on average across their entire lifespan. Whereas you can see as the time goes on here, these males that are in these surveys are actually indicating they love to have many, many more partners. In fact, you get up to closer to 20 as their goal of having the number of partners. So again, sort of showing us the Coolidge effect. This is just, by the way, their number of desired partners, but again, they're going to be constrained by the number of females that are willing to mate with them. How about the likelihood to consent to sexual intercourse after having known an attractive member of the opposite sex? This tests the idea that there's going to be a difference between men and women in terms of how much investment and time they want to put into the whole thing. So if the idea here for a male is that he needs to get that female pregnant so that she's now going to be able to have some offspring, and then he wants to move on, he's going to be moving fairly quickly. He doesn't want to wait necessarily for how long it's going to take before they actually have sex. So in these studies of these same kinds of samples where they look at 18 to 20-year-olds, you can say, what's the likelihood that you would have sex with somebody at all these different time periods? So you can see that, let's say you've known somebody for 5 years. You've been dating for 5 years. What's the likelihood that the two of you are going to have sex? And you can see that on the y-axis, that's just a relative measure of what's the likelihood that they would actually have sex. And you can see there's no difference between men and women. Males and females in this study are equally likely to say, well, gee, if I've known somebody for 5 years, I would definitely be having sex with them. Now let's go down to 1 year or 6 months, and you can say, okay, now the question is, what's the chances that you would agree to have sexual intercourse with somebody after just 6 months of knowing them? You can see that the men are fairly still pretty high still, right? They're still up there where they would be for 5 years, but already there's a drop in the number of the likelihood that a woman's going to say that she would consent to having sexual intercourse. Now we get down to the far right. You can see we get down to 1 week, 1 day, 1 evening, 1 hour. Those are very short time periods to say how long you've known somebody. Like only you've known them for a week. You've only known them for a day. You just met them this evening. You've only known them for an hour. What's the likelihood the two of you are going to have sex? And you can see for women, that's about the lowest you could possibly be. There's very low chance that they would consent to sexual intercourse. But men are saying, hey, it's less than 5 years or 6 months, but it's still pretty high relative to what women are willing to do. And so again, it shows us that maybe males have like a lot less of a barrier here in terms of wanting to have sex with somebody, want to just move on, whereas that female is going to be choosier about who they're going to want to mate with. All right, so here's some other ways of testing sexual strategies theory that Buss has looked at. Buss in 1990 conducted a very large study across 37 cultures, including some of these participants were at the University of Queensland at the time. So there were 9,500 university students, and they rated how important or desirable each of 18 qualities was for choosing a mate. So for example, that they have a dependable character, that they have chastity, basically it means that they're a virgin, that they have good health. Okay, how important are those things? And they found a lot of variation across all of the 9,500 people. And some of the variation in what they chose as being important to them, about 2.4% of that was due to the gender that the person indicated they were. So males and females did have some variation in terms of what their preferences were. Okay, and we're going to be talking more about that in a moment. The other thing that you'll see, though, if you actually pick up that article from 1990, is they found that 14% of the variation in terms of what they thought was important was actually due to the different cultures. So in fact, 7 times more of the variance was explained by culture than due to gender. So if you're going to think about culture versus gender, the way Eagly and Buss are kind of arguing about it here, here's data from Buss's own study that culture seemed to be even more important in explaining variation in mate preferences in terms of what's attractive than does gender. But that just moves on. After that statement that Buss makes in the article, he just continues on. It doesn't talk about culture again. All right, let's go to just looking at these gender effects, the females versus the males and what they do. So what I'm going to show you here is just some of the different items, and I'll just show you a small sample of some of the countries or these cultures that they were looking at. So here we have China, Palestinian Arabs, Zambia, USA, and Sweden. In terms of how important is it when you're thinking about a mate that they've had no previous sexual intercourse, right? Now you can see that in China, at least in 1990, this was very important. It was a high difference there, and there wasn't actually a difference between females and males in terms of when they're thinking about their partner. They want their partner, though, to have no previous sexual intercourse. For Palestinian Arabs and Zambia participants, you can see that they show a gender difference here, where males, it's more important for their partners to be chaste. Females, it's not as important. In the US, it's not as much as important as it is in those other countries, and it's only a slight difference between males and females. When we get to Sweden, they have the lowest preference for having no previous sexual intercourse, and there's no gender difference there. Now, what about a good financial prospect? Like when you're thinking about mating with somebody, you're looking at this potential partner, how much does it matter how good their financial prospects are, what their earnings potential could be? Now, here are 5 countries again: Japan, Zambia, the former Yugoslavia before it split up, Australia, which I told you is largely Queenslanders, and the USA. And you can see in all of these countries that women are indicating that it's more important, it's closer to the high end of there of indispensable than it is for men. So the women in these different cultures are tending to say that it's more important to them than it is for men to have a partner who's got good financial prospects. What about the age difference between yourself and your partner, this person that you're interested in? And here again, we have 5 different countries: Zambia, Colombia, Poland, Italy, and USA. And you can see that for these countries, all of them are indicating that the women would prefer to have somebody who's older than themselves, like by 4 or 5 years, whereas the other countries, they prefer, the men there prefer having somebody who's younger than themselves. In Zambia, they prefer to even have somebody who's like 7 or 8 years younger than them. Italy, Poland, USA also are showing this preference among the men to have a slightly younger partner. So age becomes another important factor in terms of like whether or not you find the person attractive. A more recent study that was published in 2018 in Science Advances looked at this in an online dating market, and they looked at basically how people did in terms of when their profiles are put up and how attractive it was to other men and to women. And there's only just a couple things that I want to show you quick, is that over on the left, you can see that when women were being ranked for their desirability based on how much interest their profiles showed across these 4 cities of New York, Boston, Chicago, and Seattle, that the older the woman got, the less that became a desirable trait in a woman. So you can see that the most desirable women are actually the youngest, and then the least desirable are the women who are 50 or 60 years old. For men, they don't show that same sort of effect. In fact, there's a slight increase from 20 up to about 50, where you can see as the man gets older, that's more attractive to the people on this particular dating site. And so men tend to show this effect. It's only after about the age of 50 that you could see sort of a drop. It goes down a little bit, that they're less attractive. One other thing to point out is over there on the right, education. And this probably has a lot to do with, again, earnings potential. And you can see that when you look at women here in terms of whether or not they just went to high school, they've had some college or finished with their university degrees, and they've also got a post-grad degree, you can see that it doesn't really matter a whole lot to men who are rating or looking at these women, whether or not they have much of an education. But for men, in terms of whether or not they just have like an high school education, a university education, or a postgrad education, the more educated they are, the more desirable they look to women on this particular website. And again, like I said, it probably suggests that they see it as that indicator of education means you're going to have more earnings potential. And so because they show that they have more of an education, that becomes more important to women when they're looking at these profiles of men. This is a sort of conclusion from this Brook and Newman study from 2018. They say, once we have our desirability scores, we can use them to identify characteristics of desirable users by comparing scores against various user attributes. As shown in Figure 2, for instance, average desirability varies with age for both men and women, although it varies more strongly for women and the effects run in opposite directions. Older women are less desirable, while older men are more so. For women, this pattern holds over the full range of ages on the site. The average woman's desirability drops from the time she's 18 until she's 60. For men, desirability peaks around 50 and then declines. So take that for what you want, but this kind of supports some of those predictions from sexual strategies theory. Now, in the sum of all of the work that Buss has done in that study back in 1990, and he talked about this in the video as well, he would summarize it that when men are looking at women, and by the way, you'll notice that all of this is assuming a very binary, heterosexually oriented explanation for sexual characteristics. And that's been basically the case for a long time in evolutionary social psychology, although more recently they have started paying attention to same-sex attraction. But most of this work has been founded on the idea that because of evolution and the pressures of wanting to pass on genes to offsprings, they focus more on heterosexual attraction. Anyway, back to what Buss was saying in 1990, he says from all of his research that men tend to value youth, beauty, and health, whereas women are valuing earnings potential, ambition, and industriousness. And the conclusion is that men are seeking women who are best able to produce healthy offspring. That's why they want younger women. They want a beautiful woman because it kind of indicates that she doesn't have any health problems that might cause their children not to be born, and same with in terms of health, overall health. Whereas women are more interested in whether or not that guy is going to be able to help support their offspring, so that she's supposedly more interested in their earnings potential, and so therefore women are seeking men who will be best able to care long term for them and their children. In the 30 years or so that this kind of research has taken off and many people study it, you can see that this is a sort of a funny little picture that sort of summarizes a lot of the different things that they've looked at in that field of research in terms of other characteristics that would matter in terms of what makes people attracted to one another. And you can see things there like they've found that men who are slightly above average in height are considered more attractive. The men who have more prominent cheekbones, a large jaw, a slightly above average upper body musculature, wrist and ankle symmetry. Whereas women who have large eyes, a small nose, full lips, small chin, firm symmetrical breasts, smooth unblemished skin, and a waist-to-hip ratio of 0.7 are supposedly more attractive. The waist-to-hip ratio, by the way, has to do with whether or not you can bear children, and there's some evolutionary evidence to suggest that you're going to have an easier time bearing a child at the time of labor if your waist-to-hip ratio is around 0.7. And so that's supposedly pressure then that men are looking for in their females and hoping that they're going to be able to give birth okay, and so they might be looking for a waist-to-hip ratio of 0.7. All of this, like I said, is a huge amount of literature. I could probably go on for several days lecturing about all this and telling you about all the different findings. I want to finish this particular lecture by looking a little bit more at the face stuff, about what makes faces more attractive. You'll recall that in lecture 10, we talked about how women prefer more masculine faces, and particularly on high fertility days. And Gildersleeve had that meta-analysis in 2014 in which they looked at all of that. So if you look at these two faces and you say which one is more attractive, what tends to happen is that most participants will pick the one on the left, the one that looks that fuller sort of face, the more masculine face. And it turns out that that masculine kind of face is associated with higher testosterone. Okay, so the link is that when you look at men who have a more masculine face, and then you were to measure their baseline testosterone, you'll find that they have higher levels of testosterone than a man who has a face that doesn't look so masculine. So that's that hormone behind these manly muscles, the strong jaws, prominent eyebrow ridges, facial hair, and deep voices. So they're all these sort of, again, organizing features of that hormone that could possibly then signal to a female that they've got this very masculine possible partner. Now, testosterone is also an immunosuppressive, and this means that a man must be healthy and in good condition to be able to withstand its effects on his development. So you could also argue that the reason why testosterone is sort of selected for by females is that in order to have all those features that look so manly, they've taken a risk here by not having as good of an immune system because their testosterone levels are so high. So if you've got this man who is healthy and he's got all of these masculine features in his face, it basically also could be signaling that he's got good immunity and that he's been able to survive even though he's got high levels of testosterone. And it's also that testosterone is also linked to other traits related to strength, things like fitness, fertility, their own fertility. Males who have higher testosterone are probably more likely to get the female pregnant, and also dominance. But there is a downside to having high testosterone men, these high levels of testosterone. And we can see this in some very old research now from 1998, where they look at things like marriage and divorce and male testosterone. In this study by Mazura Michalek back in 1998, they looked at 2,100 Air Force veterans, and they were able to measure their testosterone levels. And all of the men in there, then they can look at those men in terms of like the distribution of testosterone levels. And they particularly focused on the men who had testosterone levels that were at least one standard deviation above the mean. So they're up there in like the top 15% in terms of how much their testosterone levels are. And among those men, compared to all the other men in the sample, they were 43% more likely to get divorced than men who had more normal levels of testosterone. They also were 31% more likely to leave home because of marital problems. So they're more likely to abandon the family with this higher level of testosterone. 38% of them were more likely to cheat on their wives. And 13% were more likely to admit that they hurt or hurled things at their spouse. So you can see there's a downside of picking a guy who has high testosterone. Looking at that high testosterone face, and he's got that deep voice and all that, also means that you're putting yourselves at risk for these things. Now, a question that could be relevant to all this is, can women actually detect faces with high testosterone? Are they able to look at a face, make a judgment about it, and then does that then turn out to be a good predictor of what the guy's actual testosterone levels are? Well, Roney et al. In 2006 had women look at pics of men whose testosterone levels had been measured. And they found that the men they rated more masculine were actually those with higher testosterone. So the women would look at these faces and say, those guys look more masculine, those guys don't look so masculine, and the ones that looked more masculine were the ones with higher testosterone. But Roney et al. Also found that the women could detect men who enjoyed children more. And the way they were able to measure this, they didn't have like a hormone measure of how good the man enjoys children. They had actually tested all of these men in the lab with an infant to see how good they are with an infant, and then they had some observers basically score how the guy was with a baby. And they found that women could look at these men that they didn't know. Again, these are just pictures of the men, right? So the men are not shown with a child, but the experimenters have data about how that guy did with the infant in the lab test. And they found that women could actually figure out which men were the ones that enjoyed children more. There was something about their faces that allowed them to figure out that guy, he'd be good with kids. That one, no, not so good. And it turns out that those two traits were not correlated in the men. And they were not really perceived as correlated by the women either. So there are two very different things there again, and it kind of goes back to that earlier study that I was telling you about like Japanese participants who were on the pill or not and all that. That basically there's two sort of pressures on here. Women are maybe looking for very masculine men who can kind of protect them, that look handsome, and they're possibly going to have good health. But at the same time, they also risk the fact that these men might not be the best in terms of being a father. Now, another thing about all this is that culture could be playing a role. And so this is an interesting study that was published in 2010 in the Proceedings of the Royal Society of Publishing Proceedings B of Biological Sciences. And you can see the title there, The Health of a Nation Predicts Their Mate Preferences, Cross-Cultural Variation in Women's Preferences for Masculinized Male Faces. So again, they use stimuli like the one you see down here. We have 4,795 women across 30 different countries, and they indicate, looking at a bunch of pictures like that, which one they think looks more attractive. And basically, you could then see how much they prefer more masculine faces versus less masculine faces. And what was nice about this study is they found a relationship between how good healthcare was in that country. And what's being shown there on the x-axis is that if you have a lower score on the National High Health Index, that means that you have poor health support in that country. So if you get sick, you don't really have the best doctors, there might not be insurance, there's more problems getting access. The care for medical care is worse. Over on the right, those would be countries that had relatively high good care of national health. And you can see that in those countries where the National Health Index is lower, those are the places where women had more of a preference for masculine faces. And as you get to a place where there's better health care, women are not showing that same sort of preference for masculine faces. So that's an interesting thing there, is trying to say that, perhaps if there are signals from the culture about how safe you're going to be if you get pregnant, you've got some backup, maybe that changes your preference then for how masculine the male has to be in terms of attractiveness. These two pictures are two people who don't exist, but they're very masculinized and very feminized faces based on research. So the woman on the left has all these sorts of features that research show, basically makes her the sort of the most ideal attractive female. Over on the right, you've got a highly masculinized male, and these two are rated by most participants as highly attractive, whether they're male or female. A lot of this research about what makes a really attractive face came back from this stuff back in the 90s, where they would take morphs of different faces. Like the one on the upper left is 2 different faces that have been morphed together. Then you can see 4 faces being morphed together and so on. And when you get down to the bottom, you get 32 faces that have been blended together. And basically what they found was that the more the face had represented the average of a lot of other faces, the more people found that face attractive, which suggested that perhaps the faces that we find most attractive are the ones that are like the most average face, the one that least deviates from whatever our ideal is of the average, okay? The thing about that, though, since then is we've now known that there are still sort of like little features that kind of bias us even more. And so you can see there on the left, there's a very averaged face, and it's an attractive person. But over on the right, you might see that that one looks even more attractive, because what they've done is they've taken some of those cues that make females look a little bit more attractive and played with her features to make her even look more attractive. So it's like a feminized, averaged face. That whole thing about an average face also relates then to symmetry, because the more the face has been averaged, the more you're going to get symmetry in the face. And it seems that that's another important feature that we pay attention to when we're looking at attraction. So for example, here are 2 people that you may not even know anymore who they are, but there's Denzel Washington on the left, and then there's Lyle Lovett on the right. Now, Lyle Lovett was married at one point to Julia Roberts, and as you can see here, he's not the most attractive man. And when he was with Julia Roberts at the time, a lot of people thought, oh my gosh, what's she doing, this very attractive woman with this guy here? Now, part of the issue that's going on here, it has to do with facial symmetry. Denzel, as this picture is trying to show on the left, has a very symmetrical face. He's almost like a perfect mirror image of his face on the left and the right. Whereas you can see there in the middle, that middle photo, that's what Lyle Lovett looks like normally. And you can see he's got a very asymmetrical face. In fact, if you fixed it and you actually edited his face to make it look more symmetrical, that's what you see over on the right. And so now it's just like a pure mirror image. And I would think that most people would say he looks more attractive there because he's got a more symmetrical face. Why would we care so much about symmetry? Well, symmetry is actually an indication of successful fetal development. Okay, so it turns out that symmetry across from the head all the way down to your toes, the more symmetry you have, the more it looks like you had a better prenatal development. So that there's something, sort of a sign to the world, your symmetry is an indication that you've had good development to this point. Symmetry also correlates with other strange things you wouldn't have assumed maybe, but people who are higher in intelligence tend to have more symmetry in their faces. It's also related to health. People who are healthier have more symmetry. And symmetry predicts actual income and sexual activity. That is, people who have more symmetrical faces tend to make more money, and also they tend to have more sexual activity. Now, this could be all because, like I said, we just find symmetrical faces more attractive than asymmetrical faces. So keep in mind, this is all correlational, but it sort of fits with this idea that as we're looking around for people to possibly mate with and we're paying attention to how attractive they are, one of the other things we're paying attention to is, maybe subconsciously, is their symmetry of their faces. The last thing to address in this lecture is just, why is it that we like looking at attractive people anyway? Why are attractive people actually rewarding? Does our brain respond differently to attractive people? Now, we know that we do respond behaviorally differently to attractive people. That's a very well-known effect. But can we find where this is in the brain? What's going on there? Like, what is the brain doing that makes us want to be around attractive people? Now, what Claudier et al. Did in 2008 is they said, well, there's strong evidence that we prefer attractive people over unattractive people. Even infants like to look at attractive faces. But there's also evidence that men value physical attraction in the opposite sex more than do women, okay? So what they hypothesized is that they would find sex differences in brain areas active in reward circuits. So they looked particularly at the nucleus accumbens and the OFC, which are both active in drug addiction, right? So these are reward circuits that when you get a hit off of alcohol or other kinds of drugs, your body basically, your brain sort of responds, hey, you're getting a reward, keep doing this, right? So perhaps we do the same thing with attractive faces, that these areas would be involved in us having rewards to attractive faces. And because men value this a little bit more than women do, perhaps you'll see a gender difference then in the fMRI activity of these participants. So what they did is they had 24 men and 24 women judge the attractiveness of 90 faces of the opposite sex. So again, here it's a heterosexual sample, so they're saying that everybody's opposite sex attracted, and they're going to show them opposite sex faces, okay? And then what they did was they rated how attractive they found, and you can see there's no differences between the men and women in terms of what they thought. Over there on the top graph, you can see that's the mean response time, how quickly it took for them to make a rating. Attractiveness rating is number 4 meant that the person's not attractive at all. 1 means that they're very attractive. So you can see that they tend to show more ratings in the 2 and 3 zone, right? So they're giving like more middling response of how attractive they are. But there's really no difference between the males and females, except for down there in the lower right corner, more women were likely to choose that opposite sex target wasn't attractive at all. That's the only place, though, you see it in behavior. Otherwise, males and females were basically responding at the same time and making similar judgments for opposite sex faces. But what about in the fMRI, what was going on? So what we see here is what happens when female participants and male participants are looking at opposite sex photos, and they're looking at attractive faces versus unattractive faces based on their ratings. And what you can see is that activity in the left and the right nucleus accumbens was greater in men and women when they looked at more attractive targets. So that black bar shows more left and right nucleus accumbens activity for the female participants than it did for the male participants. So, I'll say it again, that you can see that the dark bar shows us that attractive faces elicit more left and right nucleus accumbens activity, regardless of whether or not the participant is female or male, okay? Males might be showing a little bit more of activity there, but it's the difference between attractive and unattractive that really matters. Now, when you look at the OFC, this other area that's also implicated in addiction, the female participants here are showing less activation in the OFC when they look at these faces, but there's no difference between attractive and unattractive faces. It was only the male participants that showed this, that their OFC went down the most when they looked at unattractive faces and stayed higher, relatively higher, than the unattractive faces for attractive faces. So they did show a difference in OFC. So that kind of tells us, this early 2008 study here, that yes, our brains respond to attractive faces similar to other things that we find rewarding. And it could explain like why we like to look at pictures or watch movies of attractive people, because basically our brain is getting nucleus accumbens activity happening. We're basically getting that reward circuit going when we look at attractive faces. Finally, we could even look at this question as we think about the next lecture, which is, does physical attractiveness even matter? Does it really matter? Sure, we find it rewarding to look attractive, beautiful people, but does it really matter in terms of relationships? And so here's a study that was published by McNulty et al. In the Journal of Family Psychology in 2008. They had 82 couples who had gotten married, and so this is within their first 6 months of marriage. And they completed questionnaires, and then they did a 3-hour interaction and interview in which the researchers could then study how that couple got along in different kinds of tasks, problem solving, marital happiness, things like that. So they had questionnaires about their marital satisfaction, and then they also had behavioral data about how these two got along during this interaction task. Well, what did they find in terms of physical attractiveness and the data that they collected? They say that the relative difference between the partners' levels of attractiveness appeared to be most important in predicting marital behavior. So what they're saying is they had everybody, each of the two people rated by other observers in terms of how attractive the two people were in this marriage. And they said that, yeah, the relative difference was what really mattered, such that both behaved more positively in relationships in which the wives were more attractive than their husbands. So they're seeing the best sorts of behaviors and the best satisfaction when the wife was more attractive than the husband. But they behaved more negatively in relationships in which the husbands were more attractive than their wives. So why would this matter? It kind of fits a little bit with some of this stuff from sexual strategies theory and from these evolutionary explanations that if a man is primarily caring about his female's appearance because she needs to look attractive and beautiful so that she can pass on good genes, and the woman is really paying much more attention to earnings potential and so on, then that might say that the happiest steady state here would be where a male gets together or marries a female who's more attractive than him, because attractiveness is more important, whereas the woman ends up with a guy who's not as attractive. But if those two things are switched, it kind of like changes the goals, right? And makes that marriage then more complicated, more difficult, more negative. And so that's just another study that sort of fits in with these evolutionary explanations of attraction. So in this lecture, we've been looking at some evolutionary theories relevant to human sexual attraction. We looked at this sort of debate about culture versus evolution, Eagly versus Buss. We looked at sexual strategies theory that's quite old now, but it's really produced a lot of really interesting findings. We talked about facial attractiveness and then whether or not attraction or beauty is actually rewarding. So in the next lecture, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be looking more at the next stage beyond attractiveness and look more at love and relationships and what we might know from a social science perspective about that. Thanks very much.